Welcome to Inside 340B Report, an insightful conversation between 340B Report's editorial team on the key issues affecting the 340B drug discount program, the nation's second largest government drug program. Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Inside 340B Report. I'm Ted Slafsky, 340B Report's publisher and CEO, and I'm joined today by 340B Report associate editors and senior writers Shannon Young and Will Newton, along with Luke Zarzecki, our national correspondent. Before we dive into the latest 340B developments, I want to let our listeners know that we are pleased to offer a special 25% discount to 340B Report first-time subscribers. You can go to the subscribe tab at 340breport.com and use the coupon code podcast25 to take advantage of the discount. I know you will find our news service to be a valuable investment. Also, I want to encourage you to check out 340B Report's business-focused podcast, 340B Leaders Upfront, hosted by Anna Mangum. The podcast showcases conversations with 340B service industry executives who are at the cutting edge of innovation and leadership in the 340B space. Quite a bit has happened in the 340B world since our last episode. Today, we will discuss Eli Lilly's ultimatum to hospitals and a leading healthcare provider law firm's response, two high-stakes oral arguments over state contract pharmacy laws, primary results for two high-profile 340B advocates, and a recap of 340B Report's recent webinar on some key 340B legal issues before the courts. Luke, you've been following the Lilly situation, and can you tell us some more about what happened this week?
Yeah, so we had two important letters that were sent to the Health Resources and Services Administration, or HRSA. And to start with some background, it's important to note that on February 1st, Eli Lilly initiated a policy that would require covered entities to report claims data for 340B drugs that are dispensed to in-house pharmacies. And that policy was for all of the company's drugs and exempted certain covered entities in certain states that have enacted 340B contract pharmacy access laws. So Lilly was the first drug maker to require claims data reporting for in-house pharmacies and not just contract pharmacies. And now they told the federal government on Monday, June 1st, that, and I quote, an initial set of covered entities, end quote, which consists of what Lilly says are the 50 largest holdouts, have 5 days to comply with its in-house claims data requirements or lose access to 340B pricing. Now, Lilly said a majority of covered entities have already submitted the data, but some, quote, again, led by the country's largest and best resourced hospitals and organized through their trade associations, end quote, have not done so. So if the company follows through, it would make Lilly the first of 9 drug makers that have in-house pharmacy claims data requirements to withhold 340B pricing for covered entities that do not adhere to the policy. The letter said that the company tried to work with covered entities who have not complied, but to no avail. And in response to the letter, HRSA told 340B Report that they are reviewing the policy to determine next steps. Then the law firm representing some of the covered entities, Hall Render, they wrote a letter to HRSA on Wednesday, June 3rd, that said Lilly misrepresented the firm's interactions with the drug maker and called on the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General to investigate the claims data policy. Hall Render said it participated in around 12 meetings with Lilly as legal counsel to covered entity clients, and Lilly said it would provide a written analysis of the HIPAA concerns raised by covered entities, but never did so. And Hall Render also said that Lilly's characterization that a majority of covered entities have complied with the policy is misleading, and that the drug company is trying to mislead HHS in an effort to have oversight and enforcement authority over the 340B program. And HRSA did not respond to a request for comment on Hall Render's letter. Shannon, you've been reporting on some manufacturers that have similar policies. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so thanks for that, Luke. So while Lilly was cracking down on covered entities and sending out these letters. Sanofi also announced that beginning June 15th, hospital in-house pharmacies must submit claims-level data elements, quote, for all 340B utilization for covered outpatient drugs. And that must occur within 45 days of a drug's dispense. Sanofi exempted a total of 7 states from its policy. They include Arkansas, Colorado, Louisiana, South Dakota, Tennessee, Vermont, and Washington. Now, as Luke noted, it is not the only drug maker with this policy. Exelixis, which I believe is how that's pronounced, was the first drug maker to announce that in late 2025. It was followed by Eli Lilly, Biogen, Bristol Myers Squibb, Novo Nordisk, AstraZeneca, UCB, and Amgen. That is in no particular order, but those are the 9 drug makers that now have these policies. And we and a bunch of 340B observers expect that that list will continue to grow, just as we've seen contract pharmacy restrictions become more prominent among different drug makers. Again, each drug maker to announce one of these in-house claims policies has taken a different approach to state exemptions. Some have exempted all states with contract pharmacy access laws or data requirement laws that have been passed. Some choose just a few of those states. And so we have a few great trackers that track not only the contract pharmacy restrictions, but the drug makers with these policies and which states are exempted and which ones are not. And speaking of contract pharmacy access laws that vary by state, Will, you've been doing a lot of great reporting in the last couple of days on oral arguments in lawsuits challenging 2 of those state laws. What can you tell us?
Definitely. It was a very big week in the courts where on June 2nd and June 3rd, we had back-to-back oral arguments over 340B contract pharmacy access laws in Maine and Rhode Island. Both of those were before the First Circuit Federal Appeals Court in Boston. And this is a really big deal because the First Circuit is yet to weigh in on these state laws. So this means that yet another circuit's going to get involved, and it will have really important national implications, sort of where these courts land. In both of these cases, federal district courts in Maine and Rhode Island, they had ruled against manufacturers' motions to block enforcement of those laws. Manufacturers then appealed those, and now the oral arguments for those appeals are what took place. So starting off with Maine, in both cases, the 3 judges on the panels were really questioning both sides, or asking a lot of tough questions, both to the manufacturers bringing the appeals and then the state attorneys who are defending their states. When I listened specifically to the Maine case, it did look like the judges were a little more skeptical of the state's arguments there. Whereas in the Rhode Island case, it seemed the judges were at least a little more receptive to what the states were saying in terms of their ability to enact these laws to regulate health and safety. That said, it's really hard to tell based on an oral argument what exactly is going to happen. The judges are going to consider this. We've seen a lot of different decisions so far, so we can't read too much into it. But all we do know is that they were pretty tough all around for all parties. What was really interesting and unique about these oral arguments, though, was this was the first time that the federal government had actually joined in the arguments as well, to join manufacturers in arguing against these state laws. So in both oral arguments, an attorney for the federal government joined and split time with PhRMA, the drug industry trade group, to argue that these state contract pharmacy laws unpermissibly interfere with a federal program. And so that was very noteworthy to sort of see the government enter there. We've done some interesting coverage about one of those attorneys who was arguing for the Department of Justice during the Maine case. He previously represented drug manufacturers in drug pricing litigation before joining the federal government. And that was, a really interesting development. So we'll have to see how they respond there. The other sort of interesting thing that we wrote about this week pertains to one of the judges that was on both 3 judge panels. And this judge, Judge Dunlap, he was nominated by President Trump to serve on the federal bench last year. He was confirmed by the Senate last November. And up until then, he was a partner at a Portland, Maine law firm called Pierce Atwood. While he was a partner at that law firm, two other partners at his law firm were lobbyists for pharma. They were paid by pharma specifically to oppose Maine's contract pharmacy bill before the state legislature, before that bill actually became law. Dunlap himself, the judge, he was not directly involved in this lobbying, and his firm did not represent pharma when pharma ultimately challenged the law that they had been lobbying against. But nevertheless, it's a pretty interesting connection there as well. So that's something else that we've been following closely. And the final thing, while we're talking about courts, I think it's worth noting, and we're going to go into this in a little more depth later on in the podcast, there's a pretty big development in the Fourth Circuit, one of the other federal appeals courts that is overseeing these cases. And that is that a full panel of judges is going to rehear two decisions that went against state laws in West Virginia and Maryland. So we'll have more on that very soon. But before we go back into some of these state developments, Shannon, I know you've been covering election season, and a lot of big 340B players, both advocates of the program and advocates of major reform, have been up for various elections. And we had some more recent primaries. So what did you hear there?
Yeah, so we've had some more election results come in the past week, and these were primaries in California and South Dakota. So we'll start in California. On Tuesday last week, we had Doris Matsui, who placed first in the state's Democratic primary for the 7th Congressional District with 31% of the vote. And that's according to unofficial results. And so this is noteworthy because Matsui is a pretty big figure on 340B. She's sponsored a lot of bills that have been backed by 340B providers, hospital groups, community health center groups, and is considered a very good friend of the program in Congress. She also serves in a senior role on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And so she is somebody who 340B providers and advocates have really looked to in Congress to advocate for a lot of their causes. Her election or re-election bid faced its first major challenge in several years. She faced a progressive Democratic challenger in Mai Vang, who is a Sacramento City Council member. And Vang placed second with 25% of the vote, so pretty close to Matsui's 31%. And we do expect the margins to change probably slightly as the final results come in and provisional ballots and mail-in ballots are tabulated. But what is interesting about how California does its elections is that the top two finishers in a congressional district race end up going to the general election. That's regardless of party affiliation. So Vang ended up placing higher than Zachariah Wooden, who was the top finishing Republican. He had 24% of the vote. According to unofficial results, Wooden is a pretty newcomer in politics. He's a college student, but he has served on, at the local level in different advisory committees. And so again, these are all unofficial results. The California Secretary of State's office will certify them by July 10th. And then we will know for sure. But right now, the way it's looking, it looks like it will be a rematch of Matsui and Vang in November. And so these two, I think, are going to battle it out a little bit more in the coming weeks and months. And Matsui's seat is far from safe. So it will be interesting to see how she approaches the general election. It's also noteworthy that Matsui is in her 80s and Vang is in her 40s. And this is seen as a race of, quote, generational change that is happening in the Democratic Party in California and across the country at a larger scale. So it could be indicative of some bigger changes and trends that we're seeing there. But Matsui, she claimed victory on primary night. She said that she is ready to take on the general. She noted that she has a very senior role on a very consequential committee, and that if Democrats win back the House in the midterms, then she's in a great position to represent Sacramento residents in Congress. And so that is something that Vang's going to have to compete against. And this is something that 340B providers will want, right? If Matsui has a senior role on this E&C committee, that bodes well for their chances, especially since Buddy Carter, who was a big-time figure on the E&C committee, will not be coming back to Congress in 2027. He lost his recent primary. He was running for Senate in Georgia. And so he finished third in his race. And Bill Cassidy, who is a senator from Louisiana, is another big 340B detractor or critic. He's called for a lot of program changes. He's also not returning to Congress in 2027. He lost his reelection bid to the Senate by placing third. And the way those states' primaries work is the top two finishers in the primary move on to a runoff. So they are essentially out of Congress next year. And so if Matsui doesn't hold on to her seat, it opens up even more change in the 340B advocacy world and creates new places for people to step up and take on this mantle. Another person who will be leaving Congress in 2027 is Dusty Johnson. He is a Republican from South Dakota. Now, he was planning on leaving Congress anyway. He ran for governor of South Dakota in Tuesday's primary last week. And so he ended up placing third. He will not advance to a runoff there. The two frontrunners, who is Governor Larry Roden and Toby Doden, who is a businessman and somewhat of a political newcomer, they are advancing onto a runoff in July. Roden got 25% of the vote, and Doden got 31%. And Roden is noteworthy as a 340B figure because when he took over for Kristi Noem in 2025, he ended up signing that state's 340B contract pharmacy access bill. So that is, even though Dusty Johnson will not be in the governor's office, there still could be one lawmaker in there who has shown support for bills like this contract pharmacy access bill. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in that runoff. The only other candidate in that race was House Speaker John Hanson, who placed fourth behind Johnson with 21% of the vote. So, yeah.
Well, that's very interesting, Shannon. The state of South Dakota, as you know, is very important, considering that Senate Majority Leader John Thune is from the state, and it has a long tradition, which I think you mentioned in your article today, of being supportive of the 340B program. Not only has Dusty Johnson been a big supporter, but before them, Kristi Noem was a big advocate for the program during her time as a representative. Before she became governor, she was the only state rep for the state. So I don't think that will change, considering the large number of covered entities in that state and their close relationship with their legislators. But certainly the loss of Dusty Johnson is a big one for the provider community, and they're going to have to find another champion to help the cause. I know that they already have found a few other Republican lawmakers that they're working with, but he was certainly one of the big advocates.
That's a really great point. So it'll be interesting to see who emerges in the South Dakota delegation as the new chief 340B leader.
Right. And it's one of those states where there is only one representative, which I find always very interesting when you have a state as massive, at least in geographic scope, as South Dakota, but they only have one rep. With that, we're going to take a break now, and we're going to hear from one of our great sponsors.
Pillar Health sets the standard in 340B with innovative solutions that empower organizations and drive operational success. With a foundation of integrity, exceptional service, and relentless innovation, Pillar Health takes the complexity out of managing your 340B program. Focus on what matters most, serving your community, and let Pillar Health handle the rest. Find out more at pillarhealth.com.
Will, last week we had a great webinar with some of the leading lawyers in the country who are real experts on the 340B program and have been active in the current debate going on in the courts. Will, could you tell us more about that great webinar and some of the highlights?
Yeah, definitely. So last week on June 3rd, 340B Report held a subscriber-only webinar really diving into some of the biggest legal issues facing the program. So Ted, you and I were joined by Ron Connolly, who has done a lot of work for 340B providers, including defending them as interveners in some cases over 340B contract pharmacy bills and laws. And then also Bill Sorrell, who previously worked in private practice as an attorney representing drug manufacturers for a while. And he has been a very vocal advocate for the manufacturer perspective recently. So we talked a lot about litigation over state contract pharmacy laws, some potential new legal pathways that providers have been pursuing to challenge alleged overcharges. But I think I want to focus on, for my main takeaways, some of the things that our two attorney guests really agreed on. Because, right, we know they disagree on a lot of things, including whether or not these laws were legal, but there are some interesting points of agreement. The first, and I think most important one, is that they both really agreed that it was a very big deal that the Fourth Circuit granted these requests for a rehearing. I alluded to it earlier, right? But there was one 3-judge panel that issued a pair of 2-1 decisions against Maryland and West Virginia's contract pharmacy law. The state attorneys general appealed that and basically asked for the full court to rehear them. And so now the full 15 panel of Fourth Circuit judges is going to rehear them instead of just the 3-judge panel. And this is very rare for these to get granted. I think Bill Sorrell mentioned during the webinar that less than 1% of these are granted overall. And in general, when they are granted, that's usually a pretty good indicator that it's possible that the court is going to reverse or at least change the previous decision. It doesn't have to, but that's normally an indication that it will. And Ron was in agreement there that it was a very big deal. And so, Ron viewed this as a very promising sign for providers. Bill Sorrell said that this was certainly a concerning sign for manufacturers, but they both really agreed on the magnitude of that new development that we're going to continue following closely. Another thing that they were on agreement with was that looks like there's more and more of a chance that this issue over state contract pharmacy laws is eventually going to make it to the Supreme Court. Both of them said that if we have a circuit split, right, where some federal appeals courts are saying one thing and then others are saying another, that really increases the chances. Ron noted that, if the Fourth Circuit does reverse its decision, we no longer have a circuit split. So that could kind of lower the likelihood. Bill was a little more bullish that this was very, very likely headed to the Supreme Court at some point, though he noted that, at the speed at which the judiciary moves, if this does happen, it might not be for a couple years. And then the final thing I wanted to point out that there was really strong consensus among Bill and Ron and even you, Ted, is that a really big theme in the 340B program recently is that so many issues are being resolved in the courts. So stakeholders all around, whether or not it's 340B providers, manufacturers, GPOs, others, are increasingly turning to the courts to try and advance their policy position. Bill hypothesized that a lot of this has to do with the fact that a lot of stakeholders have lost faith in regulators and HRSA. And Ron spoke a little bit to the fact that regulatory agencies increasingly have less power now due to some court decisions that have sort of lowered the deference that federal courts give to agency interpretations of statutes. And so that's another potential reason as well why there has been so much movement towards the courts. And so I thought it was really interesting to focus on these 3 areas of agreement in a world where manufacturers and providers don't agree on much. There was certainly some consensus there. And then, Luke, I know you covered the webinar for us, wrote a really great article on it last week. Can you tell us a little bit about what you kind of saw there and what your main takeaway was?
Well, Will, you took some of the words out of my mouth. Some of your takeaways were my takeaways, but I also thought it was really interesting that both attorneys mentioned that they did not see a conflict of interest in the attorneys who formally represented drug makers writing amicus briefs for the Department of Justice for cases that involve 340B contract pharmacy and rebate litigation. Sorrell noted that it is not a situation of a lawyer switching sides on an issue to represent an opposing party, and that it was not a situation of the attorneys changing their position on an issue. And Connolly agreed and that it was not a conflict of interest, but he did say the optics are pretty terrible and that it gives the impression of the administration siding with manufacturers.
Yeah, that's interesting, Luke. I was also interested to hear that take from these two very prestigious attorneys. I will tell you that speaking to 340B providers throughout the country and national organizations, I think a lot of them are very frustrated with the fact that former drug industry lawyers who were working on behalf of the drug industry, maybe even just a year ago, are now working for the Department of Justice and weighing in on the side of pharma. There's also, I'm sure, a lot of concern with what you found, Will, about the fact that the one of the three appellate judges on a really important case in Boston was at a firm that last year was fighting the same law that there's now before that court. So certainly, if there isn't a conflict of interest, it certainly looks to many people like there's an appearance of a conflict of interest, and it all plays into a growing belief among the 340B provider community that the current administration is out to get the 340B program. So they do feel besieged and frustrated, and certainly hearing a lot of that from my sources.
Yeah, that's super interesting to hear that, Ted. I know there's a lot of people are wondering why, the administration sort of suddenly entered the conflict or state contract pharmacy battle in February 2026 when these laws have been around dating back to 2021. So it's really interesting to hear what sources are telling you there.
Yeah, and I do think that the more that the Justice Department and HHS gets involved on behalf of the drug industry, particularly in red states, it's going to start angering lawmakers in those states. And it could be a point of contention moving forward. With that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's issue. That was a really good discussion. We'll continue to keep an eye on all things 340B related and be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Of course, we'll report on anything that happens in the meantime on our website. Please follow along with our twice weekly newsletters. And just a reminder, if you're not a current subscriber, you can take advantage of our 25% discount for first-time subscribers by going to 340breport.com and clicking the subscribe button and using the discount code podcast25. Thank you for joining us today, and have a great week.